Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 3, Cultural Evolution. Let's get into it. So, just looking at the chapter objectives, no need to read those. Continuing on with chapter objectives. And our themes for this chapter. The first theme is that cultural ideas and norms don't necessarily emerge to address universal problems. Rather, they're the result of responses to different environments and cultural learning. Cultures are fluid and dynamic, and in most cases, they change over time. Okay? Next, and to begin with, I should say, where does cultural variation come from? Ecological and geographical variation. Impact is exerted in different ways through, for example, proximate causes versus distal causes, and evoked culture versus transmitted culture. So again, this is getting at is just a major source of cultural variation are those differences in the environment, or kind of those ecological geographic variations within a particular environment. And characteristics of our own local environments can have an impact on cultural values and norms, which basically means that cultural practices at times come from the environmental pressures in a particular location. Continuing on, both proximate and distal causes aim to answer the question, where does cultural variation come from? Or why are there cultural variations in particular outcomes? So, for example, differences in Spanish and Incan weaponry, which was a proximate cause, differences that produce direct and immediate effects. So basically what we're trying to get at here is to answer the question, why the Spaniards defeated the Incas in the Americas. There are many potential causes, obviously, and there are different explanations on why they occur, and that occurs at different levels. So at the proximate level, one hypothesis is that the Spaniards had guns, steel, swords, just different weaponry, and this allowed them to quickly overcome the Incas, who at the time had more primitive weapons. So there's actually plenty of theorists that argue that you see this across the Americas with constant European war leading to an acceleration of weaponry, which then once the Europeans reached a new continent, they were able to use to their advantage against less roaring communities. Now looking at distal causes, initial or early differences that lead to effects over long periods of time, often indirectly. So for example, an abundance of easy to domesticate plants and animals spread from the Fertile Crescent across Eurasia, which allowed for the development of agriculture, which provided sufficient food for people to devote time to non-food activities such as creating tools and learning to work with steel. The Americans had no such endowments. So literally the difference of the environment producing different food opportunities and reducing scarcity, which allows for different cultural norms to develop. So in the case where there is plentiful food, you have to spend less time gathering food, and therefore you can dedicate your energy as a community to other non-food activities such as weapon development. Continuing on, looking at evoke culture, and I'm going to jump straight into an example here. So to answer the question on why some people from some cultures conform more than others, an evoke cultural explanation might say that someone has a biological-based tendency to try to avoid getting sick, avoid pathogens, infections. But this tendency might be stronger in places with a greater risk of spreading pathogens. Research has found that places with higher pathogen prevalence, people are more likely to conform. So if you have higher levels of pathogens, people are more likely to conform to whatever the norms are of that community. And basically the rationale behind that is suspected to be that there is a greater risk of getting sick. It's safer to have stricter norms for preparing food, interacting with strangers, personal hygiene, and so forth. Then it's better. So therefore, it's better to conform. So it's just kind of this idea that everybody has that biological capacity or unwillingness to get sick, but due to the cultural dynamics of a particular environment where pathogens may be more common, people are more aware of that potential of being sick, so therefore over generations, conformity develops in order to keep the culture safe. Next, transmitted culture. This involves cultural ideas that are learned via social learning by modeling the behavior of others living nearby. So, for example, transmitted culture often begins in a certain geographical area, but then cultural practices can spread and be transmitted to people beyond the particular location where it began. When people move or meet different people, they can spread their cultural ideas, and this cultural transmission is not bound by geography, especially in today's world with internet and increased travel. So going back to that pathogen example, you can the same kind of conformity to prevent illness can be passed on at a one-on-one kind of parental level. Teaching proper ways to keep the community safe. Now, interestingly, some researchers have found that ecological differences were not the only components determining the emergence of cultural variation. Edgerton surveyed communities from different East African tribes, and tribal affiliation trumped ecological pressures in predicting the attitudes of a community. Transmitted culture can play a more powerful role in cultural variation than evoked culture. So in this case, you can look at tribes that are kind of similar in similar geographical areas, and you can still find obviously differences among the tribes. Well, that's basically demonstrating that although there are similar ecological pressures, tribal affiliation and that transmitted culture through tribal affiliation kind of trumping, being more predictive of tribal attitudes, behaviors, conformity, going back to the previous example, than basic ecological pressures such as abundance of food that we reviewed for when designing tools. Now, one of the most fascinating things that I've found in cross-cultural psychology is this idea of cultural evolution and the parallels between biological and cultural evolution. Biological evolution operates through a process of natural selection. Natural selection occurs when three conditions are present: individual variability within a species for a trait. Number two, variability of that trait being associated with different reproductive rates. And three, a hereditary basis for that trait. So kind of just our basic understandings of evolution. A natural selection will occur over time when all three of these conditions are met. It can lead to an increased proportion of the trait in the population over time because that heritable trait confers reproductive advantage. So again, kind of just basic evolutionary knowledge that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Just natural selection occurring and certain traits being becoming more heritable and becoming more common in the population over time because they have a evolutionary / reproductive advantage. Continuing on, looking at specific similarities and differences, some similarities are that some cultural ideas are more prone to being passed along to others, reproduce more, and thus become more common over time. When cultural ideas become more common, the cultural evolution of norms begins. And some differences. Copying errors are rare in genes, but more common in cultural ideas. Genes can only be passed down vertically, but cultural ideas can be transmitted horizontally among peers. Cultural ideas do not have to be evolutionary adaptive. So let's look at a few of these points here. So copying eras. We talked about over-imitation, and we'll talk about it more in this class moving forward. This idea that Culture, our species is ultra social, and they are looking to copy prestigious members of society, and just kind of copy in general, because that's one way by which cultural ideas are passed. And you'll often see an over imitation where people are copying irrelevant behaviors or copying the wrong behaviors and attributing those behaviors of a particular athlete or famous cultural figure as the reason why they are famous or great at basketball, whatever. So you can see more errors in cultural ideas. And the idea with genes can be passed down vertically, so obviously through fertilization of an egg, a sperm and egg, and versus just anybody passing down cultural ideas. So it can be a bunch of 7-year-olds passing ideas to each other, or online, etc. So it's much more easier and much more dynamic, because it's so much more free and able to be passed on horizontally as opposed to vertically. And cultural ideas do not have to be evolutionary adaptive, and that's kind of similar to the first idea. Just because a cultural idea exists and can exist over time, people can have cultures can have particular ideas that stay within the culture for many generations that are harmful to the culture at large or particular minority groups within a particular culture. Factors that cause ideas to spread. For ideas to spread, they must be communicatable, useful, emotional, and minimally counterintuitive. And we're going to review each one of these four in more detail. Beginning with communicatable ideas. For an idea to catch on, it has to have some way of moving from one person's mind to that of another. Most direct way is through language. Easy to remember, sensory metaphors, he has a cold personality. In general, expressions that include a sensory metaphor tend to be used more over time than equivalent phrases lacking a sensory metaphor. The idea has to be easy to communicate to others. Ideas that are simple, useful, and socially desirable are more likely to be remembered. So, kind of straightforward here is just that humans use language, and it's one of the reasons why, as we discussed in previous chapters, that culture can be transmitted so quickly and so efficiently and communicate or accumulate over time. So through that use of language, certain aspects of language are easy to remember, and one of which is sensory metaphor. So he has a cold personality, and those kind of sensory metaphors tend to be remembered more over time because they might represent some kind of universal aspect of humanity. We all have sensory capabilities, so therefore this might lend an evolutionary advantage to those type of ideas that leverage those universal biological capabilities. Continuing on with our communicatable ideas, we are more likely to communicate with people who we see frequently. Pretty straightforward. We are more likely to be influenced by the ideas of those people whom we see and interact with. We're interacting with them more, and then because kind of we're interacting with them more, we kind of are comfortable with them, and then we're more likely to accept those ideas. Which leads us to the dynamic social impact theory. People influence each other through interacting and our relationships, which leads to clustering of attitudes in different places or cultures. And that is one theory for the origin of culture. The study by Cullum and Harton in 2007 is important because it shows how cultures can emerge when people communicate with other people around them who are in their social networks. People are most likely to communicate information that they find personally relevant, which explains how individual interests can go on to shape attitudes in a culture. And what did that study specifically do? Well, they just basically tracked students who were randomly assigned to different residents over the course of the year. And you're probably familiar with this, but just through living it, not necessarily in residency, but kind of the idea in general. Attitudes became similar, aka they clustered for stats people, within houses and dining halls, but remained different between houses and dining halls. especially if those attitudes were deemed more important. Students came to have attitudes that were similar to the attitudes of people with whom they shared a common living space, provided evidence of microcultures forming within residents on the basis of frequent interactions. So literally because they interacted within your house with people who lived in their house more, in their dining halls more. So just by raw numbers of eating multiple times a day with a group of people, living within the same house as somebody, you develop these microcultures. In this case, kind of attitudes and behaviors, which clustered within different houses. So you can follow students in different houses and then compare the attitudes and behaviors that they brought to the table at the first day of the semester, and then compare those behaviors, those attitudes, those other psychological outcomes at the end of the semester, and then you can see how they changed and within the house, and then also compare the differences at the end of the semester to see, okay, did a microculture form? And Cullum and Harn found that microcultures did form based on those frequent interactions with individuals living within their houses. Next, useful ideas. Humans are highly social and thus very motivated to be helpful to others, particularly if there is little cost in doing so. Sharing ideas gives us a reputation for being cooperative and makes it more likely that others will help us in return. Stories with useful information are more likely to be remembered and shared, such as telling a friend that there's a sale online, telling your favorite classmate where there is an open parking space on campus. So again, kind of straightforward. We're a highly social species. We are also motivated to be helpful, and we gain reputation, kind of prestige within our community, if we act cooperatively and share useful information. And that information that is useful is more likely to be remembered and shared, and then you start accumulating those microcultures or shifts at a cultural level. Next, emotional ideas. Ideas with emotional impact are also likely to spread. Shared emotional reactions allow us to connect with others, as people often feel a connection when they experience or are experiencing similar feelings. One example is contemporary legends, fictional stories told today as if they were true, aka urban legends. They're spread due to a shared emotional reaction. Stories with strong emotional impact are especially likely to be passed on. And kind of the famous example is candies containing drugs or razors or whatever. You hear about this every year. It was even more pronounced decades ago, but you still see some tricklings of it every year. And it was a dominant fear decades ago, which led to parents going through their candy, opening the candy, and investigating their candy. So that was just an example of this idea of a cultural idea spreading, because obviously parents don't want any harm to come to their child. They feel that they can prevent it, and there's kind of a general suspicion in the community. So it's just the point here is that this idea is tugging at emotions, which are shared universal, and therefore they're more likely to spread throughout a culture. In this case, Halloween candies being laced with weed or whatever. Ideas that are somewhat unexpected. Minimally counterintuitive ideas. Statements that violate expectations, but only slightly. It can't be too outlandish. For example, many religious texts, such as the Bible, contain stories describing ordinary events, but are interspersed with a few surprising or counterintuitive elements, such as a virgin birth or walking on water. Research shows that these minimally counterintuitive narratives are most likely to be remembered and passed on to others. Intuitive statements are better remembered initially, but phrases with counterintuitive content are better remembered 1 week later. So a study by Barrett and Noehoff looked at participants were asked to retell Native American folktales, and participants remember 92% of minimally counterintuitive items versus 71% of intuitive items. So the idea here is that a minimally amount of counterintuitive information within a story that is otherwise true is most likely to be remembered. even more remembered than these intuitive items or stories that are so crazy, like so outlandish, that it can possibly be true. You're not going to bother to remember it. It's not useful to be passed down. It's not useful to remember it and pass it on to the next generation, or etc. So what we're looking for is kind of that sweet spot of a little bit of counterintuitive information, but with packaged within a set of intuitive ideas that are common within a culture. Another example: which folk tales by the Brothers Grimm are the most successful? A study examined 42 folk tales by the Brothers Grimm and coded a number of counterintuitive elements in each story. So, for example, a talking mirror, a gingerbread house. Then they searched Google for the number of times each story was listed. Results showed that the more successful tales, Cinderella, had 2 to 3 counterintuitive elements. Less popular tales had anywhere from 0 to 6 counterintuitive elements. Results suggest that the most memorable stories are those that are mostly intuitive or expected, but have just a few surprises or expected violations. So again, what this study did was just look at a collection of stories from Brothers Grimm, which is just a famous collection of folk stories for children. And then kind of coded it through qualitative methods. And basically the most important takeaway from this, though, is that they found that there's, again, that sweet spot. It's not that that porridge is too hot or too cold. It's just that porridge is just right. And when that porridge is just right, aka around that 2 to 3 counterintuitive elements, people are not only going to remember it more, but in this case, there's qualitative evidence to find that they read it more, they like it more, they interact with it more, versus stories that would have less than 2 counterintuitive elements, 0, 1, or ones that are just so outlandish. And quantitatively, in this example, that would be greater than 3 counterintuitive elements. How have cultures been changing? Cultures are always changing, and they continue to change even today. Some key changes over the recent decades include interconnectedness, individualism, and intelligence. So that's always one of the kind of things that can be irritating to me looking at research, this idea of just setting a paper from 60 years ago and saying that X culture is collectivist or individualist, and then they accept that framework and then they move on with the study. But as stated here, cultures are always changing. They're not static. They're changes at macro systems of culture, of laws, politics, economics, etc. affect culture. And some of those key changes that we've seen over recent decades, we're going to get to more. We're going to cover more in detail in the next few slides. Cultures are becoming more interconnected due to reduced cost of transportation and enhanced ease of long-distance communication, resulting in the formation of global culture that transcends national borders. Many large companies, such as Starbucks and IKEA, pop culture, such as Hollywood movies. Globalization countered by backlash. So, cultures are becoming more interconnected, as stated, due to, FaceTime, messaging, instant messaging, DMs, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Being able to interact with people instantly. As long as they have internet connection and electricity, etc. Also, the ability to travel. You don't have to spend years traveling, which speeds up the transmission of cultural ideas. You also have changes at these macro level changes, where multinational corporations have spread to multiple countries, which brings with it a certain company culture, a certain set of ideas and values associated with it. And the same thing with pop culture, with more people having access to whatever Hollywood films, the Avengers or whatever, permeating across the globe, which kind of builds some certain cultural similarities within pop culture. Because of that, various populations, various countries have had various political responses to this globalization. for a whole host of reasons associated with the onset of mass popular culture and multinational corporations, some of which are economic, some of which are political, some are social and cultural. So it's just another example of people recognizing, oh, culture is changing, and whatever, depending on whatever group they belong to, for good or bad, and therefore I have to do something about that to stop that culture, revert changes, or make those changes go in a more whatever way that they desire, and in a way that promotes social welfare, or depending on your political affiliation, your certain values within your political economic ideology. So a classic example is individualism versus collectivism. You kind of see that dichotomy often, but a lot of researchers conceptualize it instead as a continuum in their various scales in various ways to rate countries or individuals or cultures, individualism and collectivism. Individualistic cultures emphasize personal goals over collective goals and being distinct from others. Practices include encouraging children to move out of their parents' home once they are college age and paying workers in a company based on merit or personal achievements. Collectivist cultures emphasize collective goals more than personal goals, and they especially focus on the goals of one's in-group, paying workers based on length of service and extended families living together. So pretty straightforward. Is a common dichotomy that we all interact with. One style of culture, individualism, focusing on your own personal goals, being distinct from others, while collectivism focusing more on your collective goals and especially the collective goals of an in-group over the individual. Many cultures are becoming more individualistic. Cultures have become more individualistic over recent decades. People in the United States have become less socially engaged and less civically active since the 1960s. The 1960s were more likely to entertain guests at homes, vote, join a parent-teachers association, socialize with their neighbors. Overall, Americans' participation in formal groups are less today than Americans in previous generations of Americans. So you're seeing like this kind of increased individualization within the United States, and kind of an increased atomization of people being less involved in the organizations, whether those are parent-teacher organizations, political parties, even church attendance going down. So this kind of loss of certain aspects of community that Americans have relied on in previous generations, alongside kind of a loss or a decline in marriage rates and birth rates as well. So you're really seeing kind of a large shift since the 1960s, corresponding to a host of economic change that has led to a more individualistic culture. And what that'll exactly mean for individuals remains to be seen. And this trend of more individualism is especially noticeable when comparing younger Americans with older generation of Americans. Proposed reasons: more pressures on time and money, increased suburbanization, more electronic entertainment, and a more secular country. So think that through. So for example, there are more households requiring, or most households now, I should say, require both husband and wife, or both people of the household, husband, wife, etc., to work. It's not just one stay-at-home parent anymore. It's due to a host of reasons, decades of wage stagnation, for example. So you need that increased income and able to survive in the world. Also, the types of jobs. Think of the gig economy now, where people are kind of working independently on their own time, with really not a large centralized workspace, or a workspace where you can interact with your coworkers as much, which lends to less participation within the workforce and less participation within labor unions, for example, which again leads to more individualization and kind of more isolation. Increased suburbanization. So what do you need for suburbanization versus kind of a city? There's less busing, you're in the car more, you're interacting with people less, and you belong to less organizations as a result. And more secular, kind of going back to the idea that with rates of church attendance going down, more secularism and especially among millennials and Gen Z, you see it's just another or there's less opportunities to engage in the community, engage in collectivist practices within a community, and more electronic entertainment, which can kind of go both ways, but kind of that general old school way of thinking is, you're online or whatever, you're not interacting with somebody as opposed to, go outside and play. Now, I wasn't exactly sure to where to put this, but I think it's most appropriate in this chapter. So we're going to talk about deaths of despair. And this is actually work out of Princeton University that has found that the life expectancy of 45 to 54-year-olds, white non-Hispanic 45 to 54-year-olds, particularly those without a high school degree, declining for years now in a row, which is unprecedented in kind of modern society. You expect with more technology and more knowledge of the medical field, better eating habits, etc., leading to an increase in life expectancy. But we're seeing that the U.S. life expectancy drops. The first bullet point says the third year in a row, reflecting rising deaths of drug overdoses and suicides. It was the longest sustained decline in expected lifespan since the tumultuous period of 1915 to 1918. The suicide rate among urban residents is 11.1 per 100,000 people, as opposed to rural residents, which were 20 per 100,000 people. It's linked to deindustrialization / loss of identity / dignity in society. In the words of a heroin user in recovery, addiction tends to start, obviously, with liking the feeling that drugs produce, or the eraser of other feelings, trauma, loneliness, anxiety, usually both at once. So this is from a book, Deaths of Despair, again from a couple of economists out of University of Princeton. And I just grabbed some of the charts and put it in here. And you really don't have to, know the specific details here. But just look at some of these charts and look at the differences between this age group, whites who are between 45 and 54 years old, who don't have a college degree, and those who do have a college degree. And you can see just massive increases in suicides, of overdoses, of drug abuse, addiction, and kind of loneliness. So that kind of I felt it was best included in this chapter because it kind of gets back to what we were talking about, this individualization and this interconnection among us, which is obviously good, but at the same time contributing to, in the case of multinational corporations spreading worldwide, kind of deindustrialization, which can shift cultures through a loss of identity and loss of identity that was previously tied to certain cultural practices. So as cultures shift, there are consequences in health reasons, and which can lead and contribute to harmful health outcomes for particular groups of individuals. In this case, white 45 to 54-year-olds without a high college degree. But you're seeing this really across multiple populations or subgroups within the United States, with lifespans dropping or remaining stagnant, and deaths of despair, such as suicides, drug overdoses, increasing or declining at rates, or declining slower than you would expect given advances in technology within our country. So as I previously stated, it's not just that the United States is becoming more individualistic. Many countries are becoming more individualistic. A recent analysis found that 37 out of 51 countries showed increasing individualism. Increased individualism is occurring also in traditional collectivist cultures such as China and Japan. So for example, Japan's increased divorce rates, decreased average family size, valuing of increased independence in deciding how many children to have. This is not necessarily, every aspect of this being good or bad, but when you combine it with all these other cultural forces, these shifts in the economy of increasing individualism across cultures, you see certain social repercussions, which in Japan's case here, we're looking specifically decreased family size and increased divorce rates. Many cultures are becoming more intelligent. The current generation has higher IQ scores than earlier generation across cultures. This is generally referred to as the Flint Effect. How much is IQ increased? It is an increase of 5 to 25 points per generation. Controversy surrounding what IQ test really matters. So the idea here is we're seeing these shifts year after year of increased scores on IQ test scores, which begs in the question, what are IQ tests? What is intelligence? These are obviously cannot be, just these biological genetic shifts, because just evolution, we understand, doesn't occur that quickly. Every 20 years, a shift of 5 to 25 points, and you can see here in the graph that just large shifts in the degree to which the amount of people are scoring on these IQ tests within a range that's considered, quote, intellectually very superior. So what does that exactly mean, and how is that occurring? So getting at that point, it is difficult to understand what increasing IQ scores really mean, since what is considered intelligent depends on the cultural context. Research shows that different IQ test scores show different increases. Scores on the SAT have been increasing over recent decades. So on some scores, or some measures of, quote, intelligence, you see increases. In other test scores, you see declines or stagnation. So again, trying to get at what are these tests exactly measuring, and what is quote unquote intelligence. And I'm sure you're familiar from previous psychology courses of different theories of intelligence, such as Gardner's view of multiple intelligence versus kind of the Bennett idea of standardized IQ test scores. But really, this is what this is getting at here. Moderate gains are seen across a variety of different measures of intelligence, but the highest increase has been shown by Raven's matrices as a measure of IQ. Now, interestingly, this test was thought to be culture-free measure of intelligence, since it doesn't require specific cultural knowledge or language skills. It relies on basic problem-solving skills. Yet some researchers are arguing, okay, well, this test is showing the highest increase in performance year after year. So how can this be culture-free? Because something has to be changing, right? And one theory is because cultures are becoming more individualized, or being subjected to more cultural influence from the West, or just attending more schooling, which allows or facilitates the development of certain cognitive strategies, which are leading to increases in scores on the Raven's matrices test. So what are the proposed reasons, at least some of them, on why people are becoming more intelligent? One is improved nutrition, which the argument is not strongly supported, since increased nutrition does not closely parallel high IQ scores, aka it's not typically highly correlated with it. Increased complexity in the world. You need a higher education now than ever before to get a good job. We've all seen those memes of, starting job requires master's, 10 years of experience, and you get paid $10 an hour. In 1890, 27% of men in the United States had more than an 8th grade education, compared to 96% of men and women in 2017. Increased complexity in pop culture, plots in movies, shows, and video games. 1950s show Dragnet, whereas the recent show Game of Thrones had more than 250 characters. So in Dragnet, there's really like a small handful of characters and really a single storyline versus hundreds of storylines in modern TV shows such as Game of Thrones. So we have improved nutrition, and then also increased complexity in the world. Getting back to that idea that we have more schooling now, so we are being our cognitive strategies are being shaped by schooling, which leads to better performance on the task, and or kind of a sharpening of our cognitive abilities to perform certain tasks, which will be reflective again in those tasks, but maybe globally in other realms as well, such as navigating a highly complex job. And also the complexity in pop culture, which may reflect that economic changes. So it could be downstream of that, it could be upstream of that, or they could be working together. It's a debate among researchers. So by people just interacting with culture more complex culture, contributing to people quote unquote becoming more intelligent, just because it requires living in this world requires more quote unquote intelligence. Only 27% of men born in 1890 had a high school education, with only 9% completing post-secondary school. In 2012, 94% of people over 25 had high school education, with 58% having post-secondary education and 11% having postgraduate degrees, that is master's, PhD, law degrees, etc. So you can see kind of some of those years in the bar graph to the left. So the idea here, and this could also be linked to industrialization. So one reason why industrialization and education are so closely linked is because you need an educated workforce, as just outlined in the previous slide, to operate machines or do more complex tasks, which require people leaving their small schools or small hometowns and going to larger institutions, or at least large relative to their previous schooling, which allowed for an increase in cognitive skills, which are then reflective in these IQ or intelligence tasks. So shifts in kind of the economy, contributing to shifts in the culture, leading to shifts in better, increased IQ test scores or intelligence test scores. Cultural persistence in the face of change. An interesting feature of culture is that not only is it dynamic, but is also maintained over time. Despite the fact that some cultural practices change over time, other cultural habits and attitudes have been entrenched across generations. This persistence is due to previous structures, influence of early conditions, and pluralistic ignorance. So it's not that cultures are being erased, every X amount of years due to economic, social shifts or political shifts. These shifts are built on previous structures, previous conditions, and are also impacted by pluralistic ignorance. So let's review each of these in more detail. Building on previous structures. Economic development in sub-Saharan African countries. Pre-existing structure effects. Culture progresses by making changes to pre-existing ideas and structures, which are interwoven with beliefs and practices. Economic development in sub-Saharan Africa countries resulted from the constraints put on them by the slave trade, led to massive reduction in population size, the fostering of distrust, and weakening of institutions. Constraints have served to greatly hamper these countries' abilities to engage in effective economic development and may have made them more vulnerable to neocolonialism, which is the practice of using economic imperialism, globalization, cultural imperialism, and conditional aid to influence a country. Countries with high enslaved populations over time had a much lower GDP, lingering after effects of the slave trade. So a lot here, but what we're getting at here is that cultures just don't occur out of a vacuum. Shifts don't occur out of a vacuum. They build on previous structures. They're interwoven with previous structures. And that's how individual cultures and countries change. It's on their own trajectory due to their own unique past. In this case, slavery, in which the book notes is sub-Saharan Africa, but really all of Africa, contributing and leading to kind of a culture of distrust, a weakening of institutions by design. So I study the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and when when the Congolese were able to win their independence from Belgium, following decades of resistance, the rich Belgians fled the country, and what they left was little resources. And because colonialism did not require Congolese to be proficient in advanced fields such as doctors, technocratic positions like accounting, kind of the traditional white collar jobs, it left them with basically, a handful of doctors for an entire large scale population. So which meant that those institutions are severely underfunded, have little manpower, and it takes a long time to build on that due to the constraint of that previous colonial era, alongside decreases in population size and a fostering of distrust due to the kind of stemming from the necessities of colonial Belgian project. And over time, that also made them weaker and less able to resist other attempts to hamper their economic development, specifically through neocolonialism. So kind of the increased vulnerability because they started off from such a weak space compared to other powerful countries. And you can see this reflected over time with various African countries shown here, but also, in my example, DRC, having a lower GDP, which is just one measure of economic output that lasts for hundreds of years after formal slavery and after kind of formal colonialism ended. And as a result of that, recognizing that previous structure and how it hindered their future development, countries who were enslaved and their resources kind of plundered have looked for reparations. So, for example, Britain, very recently example, that's why I included it for this class, seeking for reparations, citing the wealth transfer, their population transfer, the death and suffering, leading to and creating a structure that weakened them for when they gain formal independence. They're starting off on a weakened footing, which then requires them to take out more loans and pile up interest, etc. So it's these issues that they're experiencing today, kind of stemming from those structural disadvantages that were intentionally designed from a previous era. And another interesting case study that I wanted to bring into this class was this Turner's Frontier Thesis, which is really not talked about, but I always found it interesting. And these are just some quotes that I grabbed from his Frontier Thesis. And Turner was a faculty member, kind of a no-name, really, faculty member, but ended up becoming a very famous university professor in the 19th century. And his idea here was that in the United States, settlers transformed their frontier wilderness. So, for example, quote, "Free land," he wrote, "and an abundance of natural resources open to fit people made the democratic type of society in America. America's unique democratic individualism," Turner held, "was a new product that is American. American democracy came out of the American forest, and it gained strength each time it touched a new frontier." The frontier, said Frederick Jackson Turner at around the same time, was a magic fountain of youth in which America continuously bathed and was perennially reborn. Frontier individualism, Turner said, didn't just exist on the frontier. It was found everywhere in the country, in the cities, the villages, and ports, because of the existence of the frontier. That is, because individualism was generated on the frontier and because the frontier kept a check on other collectivist policies. So what is the point of this? This is kind of the idea for Turner, was this cultural idea, this structure of the country, these and specifically kind of the ecology of the country, of the frontier, contributing, in his view, to this uniquely frontierism within the United States that allowed continual rebirth, because there was always a frontier somewhere else you can go and, in his quotes, use it as a fountain of youth, a perennial rebirth that contributed to Americans' individualism. And it should be noted, he was talking about this glowingly. This was his view. The frontier allowed for these cultural values to percolate throughout the country and stopped certain other cultural values or economic policies from occurring, such as social welfare programs or whatever specific program. So the idea here is that structure, that frontier, that initial setup of the country created a structure that lives on kind of to this day in a very individualized country, in this case, the United States. And even though, it's not about that this necessarily being true, but also that this idea, this cultural idea, existed in this country and was widely cited by multiple presidents as an idea of justifying their policies for centuries. So we have that kind of a structural analysis, and we have this idea, this cultural idea that seems intuitive and may or may not, be true to varying degrees, but having enough validity to it as defined by our culture, or that it's been able to stick around and influence policy and our culture for centuries. Next, the influence of early conditions. Another reason for the persistence of culture may be the initial conditions in which culture developed. Culture change apart from, but also is based on some initial cultural state. Initial cultural states will limit the manner in which future cultural variation takes place. Boston, which is within a historically more Puritan region, exhibits more respect for authority, and its most prestigious school, Harvard, bases curriculum on the importance of public service. Now, the degree to which that's actually happening or how they define public service doesn't matter. Not the point here. Baltzell has argued that this is reflective of the values of the Puritans who settled in this area. Philadelphia was settled mostly by Quakers, who emphasized more pragmatic concerns, individual equality and tolerance. Baltzell has argued that the University of Pennsylvania reflects the city's Quaker origins, and that it emphasizes a utilitarian curriculum, especially medical, business, and engineering degrees. So, as I've stated multiple times, culture development and change does not occur in a vacuum, but occurs from specific cultural states and built on pre-existing structures. And in this case, the examples of Boston and Philadelphia, those founding cultures, at least from a European vantage point, leading to specific and future European cultures due to their initial European cultural state within that area, Boston or Philadelphia. Next, pluralistic ignorance. Another reason why cultural habits may exist is pluralistic ignorance, tendency to collectively misinterpret the thoughts underlying others' behaviors. People try to infer others' thoughts from their observed behaviors. This is reasonable because sometimes you can accurately figure out people's thoughts by paying attention to what they say or do. However, that is not always the case. Some thoughts are more likely to be stated publicly than other thoughts, so people may collectively misinterpret what other people actually think. When everyone incorrectly assumes that everyone else is in favor of some cultural norm, they comply with that norm, thus perpetuating the culture. One survey found that most students at Princeton believed that most other students approved of heavy drinking at events, even though they personally did not approve of it. So this idea is that we are trying to interpret other people's behaviors through their actions, but we don't exactly know why they're doing what they're doing. Again, going back to the previous chapter's biases and our limitation in our cultural learning. And that is that we can't actually understand what a person is actually thinking. We're observing behaviors, and sometimes we assign the wrong intentionality to a particular behavior, and that incorrect intentionality assessment can be transferred across our culture, which can lead to persistent, incorrect, and in this case, pluralistic ignorance. And finally, cultural persistence tracks environmental stability. One clear predictor of cultural persistence versus change is climatic stability. A recent analysis over the past 1,400 years of global cultural change supports this. Regions with more climate change has more cultural change and place less value on traditions. So, for example, comparing two indigenous peoples, the Navajo and Cree, those who lived in more stable climates over time were more likely to speak their native language than indigenous people in variable climates, which is interesting in the fact of climate change. So, you can think of a lot of reasons why that would be. Maybe migration, having to interact more with different countries, which welcoming in specific multinational corporations for income due to the crops dying out, for example. So just a more mixing of culture, more instability within a culture, being driven by climate change, leading to larger shifts in cultural changes, and vice versa, more stability within a culture due to more stability within a climate. And that's all for this week. Thanks for everyone for watching. I'll see you next week. Have a great week.